Hey everybody, how's it going this week? So I recently wrote an article on Flavor.com, and I won't retread ground on which I had covered there, but it's just as a quick summary of what had happened. Um, a week ago or so, there was a quite a controversy that occurred revolving around a particular podcast called Feral Attractions. The podcast of Feral Attractions was particularly about the diversity of different sexual preferences within the furry fandom, of different types of sexual groupings and certain things like that. They would talk about the different styles, like polygamy versus monogamy, the different variety of sexualities of, straight, gay, and bi, and all those other things. But they would go more into depth about relationships within the furry fandom and how to navigate it. The idea behind the podcast was sort of a educational kind of thing because there are very strange terminologies and sort of ideas behind human sexuality, and they wanted to go into that within the furry fandom, particularly since furry fandom um, is seen as prosexual in certain instances, and prosexual expression and understanding those different kinds of sexual expressions. So they made this podcast to sort of display those concepts. Now, in an almost one of the big things that they would talk about on this podcast a lot is communication, and how it's really is a foundation of a relationship, making sure that you properly communicate with your partners about what they want, what they don't want, other things like that, so that you're not inevitably causing harm to anybody you're related to or anything like that. Um, Unfortunately, there are certain cases in this world where somebody giving advice might not necessarily be utilizing that advice within their own space. And unfortunately, this is where the whole thing comes to, is that Feral Attractions came to a basically abrupt end when words started coming out from one of the hosts. Previous relationships were saying that he was being extremely abusive during those relationships. It started with Koji, who was basically in a relationship with Vero for 5 years, and Koji got Kiro. Those are two completely different people. Too many K names in this fandom, I swear. Koji was basically saying, well, he basically financially abused me, he psychologically abused me for the last 5 years. And so once Koji came forward, multiple other people started to come forward with their own stories about Vero the Science Collie and his behaviors towards them. A link in the description below can be found to the Flavor article and a lot of other stuff in pertaining to that, because it's a lot better to read it in written form. I'm not going to delve too much into ground that's been retread there. But I did want to talk about the overall ideas of these things and how they relate to the furry fandom, because it's very important that we talk about these sort of things when they come up, because other people don't talk about um, abusive individuals and what they look for in the thing. And unfortunately, because certain relationship styles that Feral Attractions talked about are particularly taboo, such as polygamy or any of those other styles of relationships, can very much be taboo within the normal social spheres, because there's very much a society very much has a traditional style of relationship, and an idea of what that traditional style of relationship entails. And those who kind of move away from that traditional style of relationship can kind of have a stigma on them sometimes. And that stigma, interestingly enough, leads to an environment that is latent towards a higher probability of abuse. And the reason for that is because if somebody who is well meaning and wants to find love and passion, but yet finds themselves more um, more akin to being more open in their relationships, might not be so forthcoming to discuss with other people their sort of experiences, because like then they are afraid that they'll be judged because of the style of relationship that they are pursuing. So it's right for individuals who see that and understand that, can take advantage of that and go, well, I'm going to take advantage of this because this person won't talk to another person because they're afraid that they'll be judged um, for their actions and how they got themselves into that mess, and they might even take blame. You know what I mean? It's still an issue. But eventually, I think that, interestingly enough, that podcast that was trying to explain and educate people on these different styles of relationships kind of interestingly did the one of its hosts no favors, because like as people discuss the relationship styles and what makes them happy versus things like that, and then people just adapt to those different relationship styles, and things become less taboo. um, then those who are in the those who are exploited in those particular styles of relationships might feel more adamant to come forward and speak, about the issues that happen to them. And so those who had used those sort of taboos as sort of a smokescreen to kind of hide what they were doing in the shadows can very much be, um, you know, what do they called out by their exes and their exes. And interestingly enough, it's like a lot of people will say, well, yeah, there might be some contrarians who might go, well, yeah, people who are in those styles of relationships of, um, polygamy and stuff like that. They are exploitative because those relationships are in their nature exploitative. And the issue is that if that was the cause, in my mind, if it was the cause of, if abuse was caused by the style of relationship itself, then that would mean that the opposite end of the spectrum, the traditional style of relationship, that is society just comes together and accepts, would also be free of abuses. And there is a lot of evidence from a lot of people I've talked about in traditional relationships and other things such as that is not the case. Certainly, the very style of financial abuse, psychological abuse, and exploitation of the other partner is very much a thing that can happen in any style of relationship, whether it be a monogamous one or a polygamous one. Um, and interestingly enough, in another way, like those who are in a monogamous relationship and are abusive of their partner also sort of have sort of a sort of a smokescreen that they can hide behind, and that is that they only are exploiting the one partner. And because they're only exploiting the one partner, it's basically literally a he said, she said situation, especially if you're talking about very traditional relationships. It could be a very much he said, she said relation or instance where one believes one person, one believes the other person. Interestingly, in this case, where we had a person who was very much a power play polygamist exploiting his partners, um, was very much um, called out by basically all of them. As soon as one of them started talking, all of his other partners started talking. And because of all of his other partners started talking, then it wasn't just a he said, she said situation. It was a he said, and 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 he said. And so when you have numbers like that, it very much becomes a pattern of evidence that there is an issue going on. Now, one could say, well, now he's coming out, like Vero's defense right now is, it's like I was inexperienced, I was being dumb, and blah blah blah, and I want my privacy and all that stuff. But it's like, but it's important to talk about these things. And the name not is, it's the song and dance and the naming and shaming isn't the big thing that people need to be concentrating on. It's more like the education, right? Because Vero's not the Vero's not the omnibus of all abusive relationships. Like each individual person is not the omnibus of abusive relationships. Abusive relationships occur in frequent times. So the best thing that people can do is educate themselves to recognize when they're in an abusive relationship and know the steps that they need to do to get out of it. And if the relationship is extremely abusive, like how to contact proper authorities and do those kind of things. Um, Education is extremely important in order to help individuals get to what they want and where they want to be. And I think that, you know, interestingly enough, despite the transgressions of the hosts, it doesn't mean that um, the content provided by Feral Attractions was evil in and of itself. It was more like a do as I say and not as I do kind of a thing. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people in the world that fall under those categories where, they say something, but they do something else. And, doing the right thing could be difficult, but, you know, just being a decent person shouldn't be difficult, right? It's like, I think one of the other takeaways for this, and speaking of education and sort of trying to make things better for people, it's like, so where did some of this communication holes fall into place, or where did some of these things falter? Um, One of the biggest critiques of Koji was for Vero's co-host, the Red Panda, uh, and I can't remember his name. Gosh dang it! Started with an M. But so I'll call Panda Mr. M. Mr. M basically, I probably couldn't pronounce it for the life of me anyway. But Mr. M um, did make a statement about the whole situation when his co-hosts abusers came forward, or abusers, abusees, victims came forward, and he said he did notice some things, and it did make him back away from the entire podcast because he felt uncomfortable with the situations that he was seeing. He didn't recognize it sooner. He didn't come forward because he said, "Well, I feared for my safety and things like that," which says a little bit about the individual in question, which is kind of concerning. But that being said, um, but he said, "Well, I knew my co-host was into power play, and that the whole power play structure with his partners, and I did like he didn't know where like the power play stuff began and where it ended." Um, Dogpatch Press did an article about problematic fetishes, and this is sort of where this sort of thing comes into play. Um, it can be very tricky and difficult, particularly when people have these very strange things that basically, in the context of non-fantasy, would be related to abusive behaviors. Um, and interestingly enough, I think that a lot of like as more stories come forward, a lot of people are, really drawing a hard line with some of these problematic sort of fetishes, like um, age play and all these other things. Age play, um, non-con, pseudo non-con, or whatever, power play, things like that. People are starting to take a more harder line on going, well, if that person has something like that, I got to be really cautious about it. Which is kind of unfortunate because it's one of those things where it's like some people are not going to do those kind of things in the real world. Some people would, but having due diligence and caution is always, always, always the best way to go about it. Have a buddy system. Have somebody have a good friend you can trust before interacting with somebody, um, on the full, and make sure you know who you're dealing with. Um, you know, Talk to some of their exes if they have exes. If they make it a business, make it a reference sheet. Get a reference sheet. Like, do you have previous relationships? Can I talk to them? And it's like it's kind of weird. Like we don't that seems it's sort of kind of considered a taboo thing to like go well. if you had previous relationships, can I talk to the person who you were previously had relations to, or your family members, or anything like that? It's like we go to the person first, and then whatever happens, happens. It's like I guess it is what it is. It's just difficult. Like, I'm not a relationship expert. God, I am not a relationship expert for any whims or anything. So if you're looking for relationship advice, this person is the last person you want to go to. I'd more deal with you know I more deal with systems in society more than rather than personal interpersonal relationships at a personal level. But what I so basically take everything I say with a grain of salt when it comes to that. I'm so protective of my relationship of becoming intimate or doing anything like that that I really kind of like I live on it's like don't want to do any of that. So um, and it's worked out in my favor for sure. I just have had to learn how to do a lot of things myself and be very very independent, which has been very good. But at the same time, it's like you're only one person, so it gets kind of very hard to spread yourself out. As far as like having to do multiple tasks at the same time, it can get very tricky. But other than that, um, where were we talking about? Right. So when you're dealing with relationships that deal with those kind of things, it's interesting that like what has happened is there are some people who have fantasies about like very very dark topics, and it's kind of caused smoke. Like I call it the smoke, and a lot of people in this world where like there certainly are fires that are showing up that of people that cross the line and bring stuff into the real world, like the whole interestingly Nazi paraphernalia um, was a big sort of I guess fetish I should call it back in the early 2000s, and after like authoritarianism and government and abusive government started to take over as sort of a prominent um, as a prominent sort of style of governing and even successfully, sadly, even in a democracy, getting voted in, more and more people became, I'm going to clear the smoke so that I can see where the fire is, right? That if you even associate or joke about, these things, or even if you even, dance with the fire and you both and you're just even if you're just blowing smoke, I want to clear the smoke out so I can see where the fire is. And a lot of people have taken that approach, which is a fine approach. It's not obviously it can be problematic if the person who smoke all of a sudden becomes fire because they believe that like the fire actually tries to convince them it's like see they're going to come after you, they'll come after you, so you might as well go full on Monty, and that could be a problem of conversion. And so like understanding where the smoke is and where the fire is an extremely difficult thing to take into consideration. So we do have to have. I think that particularly with power play, as I was saying, his co-host Mr. M was very much confused. Like he thought that Vori and Koji's personalities were basically like they were just doing this whole power play thing when it may not have been the case. So the best way I think to kind of solve that kind of a situation is to consider making sort of a universal public sort of safe word or safety phrase that basically a person who is in a power play relationship on the lower end, or basically on the submissive end, or the basically the lower end, can say this phrase in a public space, and those in the room that know that phrase will go, okay, there's something wrong going on here. Someone might need to step in and ask what's going on and calm it down a bit. You know, and maybe it's like, well, maybe if it's not working out, you guys do need to separate, or you do need to talk to somebody about these things. Um, make it so that it is clear, right, to the person, to the person who is being the power play donor. These words are freaking weird to me. Sorry, it's not, it's sort of not really my thing. It's just sort of like I understand the words and terminologies. It's just like just weird to me. But it's like understanding analysis and things like that. It is important to kind of like help people, even if you don't quite understand their thing. Um, because if they want to, like that's the thing to me. As far as like news coverage and covering social things, it's more about not pushing people in the direction you believe they should be going. Um, it's more like if you're going to go that direction, you got to have, you got to be safer about it. You got to come up with a plan, come up with some ideas that can help people identify that there's an issue further than the case. So having that safety phrase that somebody can say in a power play relationship, either publicly or maybe privately, like Koji takes Mr. M into another room and says the safety phrase, and then Mr. M would understand, like, oh, okay, this is actually serious. This is not just some RP kind of stuff. This is really a problem and serious about it, and keeping those open communications and saying, how do I deal with this situation? How do I break this off? Luckily, Koji eventually like was able to leave that relationship, and that's good. And they were able to come forward publicly about it because it's an important conversation to have. Even if um, even if ironically the very podcast that was like putting themselves out there to discuss relationship topics and very difficult relationship issues ended up becoming an example of where those things can go wrong, interestingly enough. Um, but anyways, yeah, it's that. Speaking of that with the news, other things have kind of been going on as well. And this was a recent article that Dogpatch had released like yesterday. Apparently, um, like Dogpatch talked about particularly. Um, why is this not popping up right? So Dogpatch was talking about particular emails that he's received at Dogpatch, particularly since he covers a lot of things in regards to talking about crime in the fandom. Sometimes he'll cover topics like that, and so when certain things are happening behind closed doors, Dogpatch will receive sort of tips about individuals within the fandom that might be being abusive. Um, and so, like when talking about this kind of thing, it can be kind of a problematic thing when an individual within the furry fandom is deemed as trustworthy. It's great, um, and coming forward to them with your problems, they're glad to lend an ear. But at the end of the day, like I think people who are young don't understand that we're just fans at the end of the day. Like it's difficult to it's like we only have so much power in the world. There are certain social hierarchies and structures out there where just because somebody's covering these topics doesn't necessarily mean they're the first person to go to. Particularly if the thing that you want is for somebody to call somebody out, like it's like this person abused me, I want you to call them out. Interestingly enough, it's like this news story with the feral attraction thing really became a thing because Koji came out of their own volition onto social media, and then all of Vori's old mates came out and said, basically basically said, yeah, this is an issue. This was an issue. So basically, the reason it came out as a story was because that person came forward to social media, and this is where sort of criminality versus morality come into play. Did the Board of Science College do some illegal things? It's possible, but obviously, or was it just really, really, really ethically unsound? Because unfortunately, when people talk about legality, it's like, is something really unethical or is it illegal? And fortunately, sometimes more often than not, something can be very much legal but extremely unethical. And there are some certain circumstances where, yeah, what the person did was illegal. But unfortunately, like as just sort of a common person, there ain't much an individual can do about it. I know I've had my one or two people who would email me and ask me to cover something on this particular channel, and it's not something I could cover because I need more evidence or like basically it's like you have to ask for evidence. It's like, do you have evidence in this regard? Have you contacted authorities about it? Such and such. And like you could tell, and some certain individuals are under emotional duress, whether it's caused um, by the stress of the situation, or sometimes it is like that. In one case, I do know it's like when a person is like probably off medication and is gone paranoid, and has having a mental sort of breakdown, and they're not really thinking clearly, and that's not have to do with any interpersonal relationship. That's more like there's some conspiracies or something like that. So you have to kind of have a really sound mind. And interestingly enough, when Dogpatch says like this is not what I signed up for when covering news, unfortunately in the modern era it sort of is. People who report on actual news about actual situations with actual people are going to run into situations that are extremely uncomfortable. Um, Particularly when it comes to abuses of power, whether it be governmental or interpersonal. Um, by the way, though, using the I think interestingly enough that like some like his reaction to this, like I'm kind of done, I'm kind of exhausted, had to do with his interpersonal conflicts with someone called PK Russell, who uses like very clickbaity titles. And when to drop a nuclear bomb is very much a very clickbaity sort of title, like really really badly clickbaity, like there's nothing about anything about nukes in the entire article. It mostly has to do with interpersonal issues and coverage of shady things within the fandom of abuses. At the end of the day, I think what is necessary in that is sort of a community sort of thing, and it's not just going to be me doing it because I got a lot of other things that I could be doing, and I'm certainly not an expert in this field. Um, there certainly is a need for people to be more educating about people who would exploit other people, particularly in the furry fandom, who who very much have like a young like there is a younger the majority of the furry fandom is younger and thus a little bit naive about people's intentions. That somebody says a nice thing and can very be much appear nice on the outside, like a a Mr. Hyde, but then when the doors close, they become a Dr. Jekyll situation, and that can be very difficult. It's sort of like they're interestingly enough, it is like they, by example, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, like understanding how fictional stories and stories like that and being well read can educate you to deal with particular situations and how best to deal with it. Because having education about what actions you can take very much will help prevent you from getting into situations. And the younger you start, the better. And I think at the end of the day, I think that a lot of younger individuals are being exposed to very much things that I was never exposed to when I was young, for better or for worse. Because like like YouTube does expose, I think, people to these kind of topics, and but sometimes, unfortunately, they're sort of exploitative with that. Like when Sean Paul does this whole like loot box things, or they promote gambling and things like that. But it allows when people do something ethically dubious like that, it does allow for people to have the conversations that are necessary to talk about individuals and why things are exploitative and why those things are exploitative and why and then hopefully those young people who admire those people who are exploiting them will also see the response to it and thus understand a little bit more about the world. You do understand, unfortunately, when it comes to the news, you do understand your limits, and unfortunately, like I think Dogpatch has finally reached that limit, judging by that. And I'll put a link to this article in the description below as well. Um, Unfortunately, I kind of saw this coming, and it's like I can't really say anything because it's like he's got to do his own thing. As I said, when you're covering news, you got to kind of do your own thing, and they've got to do their own thing. Obviously, we have different styles of covering news a little bit. So, like, obviously, we're going to have disagreements on how news should be covered. But it is very important to understand that um, as a reporter, you do have to bring truth to power. If there are individuals who are being exploitative and abusive, you do need to bring those stories forth. But more importantly, I think, is you need to explain to individuals who are going to be exploited, who are the ones who those who are abusive look at and go, "Oh boy, here's a sucker for me. I'm gonna get him. I'm gonna get him." Is try to educate those individuals on those behaviors by those who are or are going to victimize them, and thus the victim can understand the steps that they can take to protect themselves from exploitative individuals, as opposed to them having to come to some savior to save them from the exploitative bad people. They can take steps to save themselves because that's a lot more efficient in the grand scheme of things, because you can't be everywhere all at once. That's the limitations of humanity. It's interesting in the fact that as somebody who covers news now, it kind of gives me a sort of an appreciation of the symbolism of the comic book Superman. Because what is Superman in his spare time but a news reporter? And really, those if a news reporter is super at what they do, is great at what they do, they can lead humanity to do feats that are way beyond what one individual can do by themselves. And I think in that way, like sort of the job that Superman does is sort of symbolic of his feats as a superhero in a sense, because like if people can come together and understand a problem and how to deal with it, they can conquer it, whether it be corrupt leaders or individuals. And obviously, like a lot of like what is it? Lex Luthor is his like arch nemesis, and he's like either he's a corrupt person who's kind of in bed with the governmental powers and stuff like that. So like, and very exploitative and very like power hungry. And so like it sort of lays into that whole idea that when you're covering news, more important than feeling like a hero or feeling like you're number one A, that you like help other people help themselves, give people the tools they need. And that's sort of my New Year's resolution this year. I'm going to be covering I'm going to be trying to do some intermittent videos that teach you and teach other people how to sort of like my thought process when it goes along with it, because it's kind of hard to teach a process like when it's sort of instinctive a little bit, but I think it'll help when it comes to covering news topics. And even better, it's like other people might be able to bring forward their own topics, because the more people that are covering in the furry fandom, I think, the less um, the less opportunity there is for individuals to exploit people's ignorances, and things like that. So, that being said, I think I rambled on enough about this particular topic, but I think it was a very important one to discuss. So, thank you very much for watching. If you like this kind of content, kick that like button, kick the subscribe button, and kick a comment in the comment section. What do you think the role of news is when it comes to dealing with individuals who are exploitative and deal with those kind of situations? Do you think that sort of the call, like, this person did something bad, get angry kind of thing is helpful? more helpful, or do you think that sort of the whole like, here's the methods that this individual, this bad person used, here's how to prevent yourself from falling into these kind of situations is more helpful? I think kind of you need sort of like in the end, I don't know, I think maybe you need sort of both, but and that's why I didn't like really, that's why I really don't get really angry about dog patches style, because it is necessary to have passion about things and to kind of show that passion and put that passion forward. But at the end of the day, it's like the passion and sort of the emotional thing works really well hand in hand if you take that passion and that emotion and those feelings and invert them into sort of like, okay, so what happened here? Is there any way to prevent what happened here in the future? At least in some way, or at least attempt to, because unfortunately, there's exploitative people everywhere in the world, and you can't stop them all, but you can at least try to, help people have the tools to help themselves and to prevent harm to others. But anyways, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next week. Thank you.